We will cover two parts today and finish the metapsychological papers. Last time we did something on the unconscious, and there are a few more remarks I would like to make, and then go to last metapsychological paper, the ego and the id. So let us look at what we left out last time in terms of the unconscious. One of the questions that comes up, partly scientifically and partly mystically, is where is the unconscious? Is it only in the mind? Is it in the gut? Is it in the calf muscles? Is it in all the three? Is it spread out in the body? Some will go to argue to the extent, is it completely inside the body or also outside the body? And if it is inside the body, is it able to travel outside the body? And this raises a set of metapsychological and mystical questions. For example, easiest to think is it should be a part of the mind. But then we have something called the gut feeling, very, very distinct. And we also see that if we take care of the gut, the mood changes. If we go on a sattvic diet, or if we go into cleaning of the gut as Ayurveda prescribes, it has a corresponding effect on the mood of the person, even the thoughts of the person. Which means that there is something which is in the gut also. Then we have the calf part where anxiety is felt in the calf muscles very, very distinctly. And as we say, there is a second heart there. And this is a kind of a second palpitation. And if there is a second palpitation, then there is a second recognition of anxiety, a second somatization of anxiety. And therefore, is there some kind of unconscious activity there? Today, just as we have come to acknowledge gut as having the second brain, is it just a question of time before we acknowledge the calf to have the third brain? So these questions come out. Then we have this whole idea of inside and outside. For example, in many patients, we see that they are able to identify unconsciously with us and give us very secret information about ourselves, which we have never revealed. And any therapist who has done a lot of therapy will tell you that patients are able to make out things about us which we have never told them. And many of them actually pose these as questions. For example, somebody asking you, do you have some psychological problem yourself, which is still unhealed? Or somebody asking you, is there a court case pending against you? Or somebody asking you, is your money stuck up somewhere? And suddenly the therapist says, oh, yes, yes. He may not acknowledge in front of the patient, but in his mind, he knows that how can the patient know it? Because he is not saying three things out of which one is coming true. He is saying one thing and that is coming true. That's a difference. This is not actually a chance occurrence. If he says 4 or 5 things out of which one comes out to be true, one can dismiss that as chance occurrence. But here you have a situation, he says only one thing and that is true. And he still does not know, but the therapist knows it is true. And this reoccurs patient after patient after patient. And that gives us this idea that just as transference, counter-transference, projective identification, these are mysterious phenomena, the occurrence of which is not in doubt, but the phenomena is unknown. Similarly, this getting one of very correct intuitions about the therapist, something the therapist will never reveal to him nor to anybody else. And this is the experience of most therapists who have been in therapy long enough. So this also gives us an idea that maybe what Sri Aurobindo and mother used to say, particularly the mother, that the consciousness actually can go out, identify with somebody, know things and come back. And this opens up a new way of knowing. Just as Immanuel Kant explained one way of knowing, how do we know something? And then Schopenhauer expanded it to include another way of knowing. And similarly, what mother says is the third way of knowing. And this expands the epistemology of knowing. And this also has an implication that this knowing is happening in the unconscious, which means in some way, either something is going out, learning and coming back into the unconscious, or the whole of it is going out, learning and coming back. Or something is being transmitted in a subliminal way, which we don't know consciously. So we don't know exactly how to answer this question at present, but we keep it as an open question. Is the unconscious completely inside or outside also? Or can it occasionally go outside and come back? Another idea is Jung's idea of collective unconscious. Now, this is a very different way of looking at the unconscious. Except for Jung, every psychoanalytic thinker talks of the unconscious as being individual. Jung is the only person in psychoanalysis who talks of a collective unconscious, which has a species connotation to it. That in a way, the million-year-old man is still inside of us evolving. So Jung's idea of unconscious is very different. There is a personal unconscious and collective unconscious. Both together constitute the unconscious, which is different from most other analyses in psychoanalysis. So when we talk of unconscious, one of the questions is, should we treat it as strictly personal, or should we also include a species component into it? Then we have Bion's idea of the unconscious. It is very different from most other psychoanalytic thinkers. Bion talks of the unconscious as being populated by two different types of entities. Entities where that part of the unconscious where there are pre-thought entities, where the thought process is still a work in progress. And fully manufactured thoughts are yet to appear. So one part of the unconscious where material which is work in progress is there, not yet become a thought. And second part of the unconscious where fully formed thoughts exist, which are available either for the waking state or for dreaming. But that part of the unconscious where thoughts are still not fully manufactured, they are not even available for dreaming. Because even dreaming needs fully formed thoughts. And there we have to take recourse to Immanuel Kant's process of knowing. What Kant says is that there is a stimulus coming from outside or inside, usually outside. Then there is a sensation. The stimulus is incident upon the body or any of the upon the body, and any of the sense catches it because the senses are spread out across the body. So the audio stimulus will be incident here, or I should say recognized here. It may be incident here also, but will not be recognized. So stimulus falls on the body, and the senses which recognize this stimuli. Our senses cannot recognize everything. They can recognize only a range of stimuli, only particular types of stimuli. They take note of the stimuli and convert the stimuli into a human sensation. The sensation, then the sensations from different parts of the sensory mechanism come together to come to a perception. Meaning, if I am looking at the computer, the visual stimuli is falling on my eyes. I can touch it and feel the tactile part of it. If it is making, if it has a speaker, it can send audio signals also. And all of them will be connected together in the brain, in the mind, so that I don't mix the visual stimulus coming from the tube light with the visual stimulus coming from here. There is somebody in the mind who is classifying all the sensation, all the stimuli coming from outside based upon from where it is coming. There is some postman which is putting letters into different post boxes. And stimuli related to one object are pulled together so that I can have a perception, that I can see the length, width, breadth, height of this thing in space and time. So it situates in space a 3D or a 2D object. It creates a 2D or 3D object and situates it in space. And then the time also is put there. That I am seeing there or I saw there at a particular time. The perception happened at this time. And then the conception comes in. The cause-effect relationship comes in. And then the knowledge comes in. The relationship to everything else that is known comes in. And new knowledge can be manufactured. And then it goes to wisdom. Now, what Bion is saying is that before the perception happens, something has to facilitate the movement from sensation to perception. It does not happen automatically. In Immanuel Kant's opinion, this was an automatic movement. But Bion says this is true only in adults. In children, when they are learning this thing, this is not automatic. Like the child is hungry, but he just feels distress all over the body. And he cries, and the mother then comes and says, "Are you feeling hungry?" And for the first time, child learns that this distress has the name hunger. 1,000 distinct things that I'm feeling right now has this name hunger. And the perception happens of hunger. And then slowly learns conception. There is a cause-effect relationship that the moment hunger happens, I feel this distress. And it is the mother who gives name and closes the infinity. When the child feels the perception, the sensations, it is like an infinity is open. He does not know what it is. It is when the name is given by the mother that the infinity closes. And he now knows distinctly this is hunger. So the mother helps the child complete the thinking process. And unless the mother is a good container, this will not happen. So the mother has to be a good container and enabler for this closing of the infinity by giving it words, by processing what the child cannot process completely, by feeling the distress of the child and giving it a name, by ameliorating the distress of the child. And this is the containing and the teaching function of the mother. And without that containing and the teaching function of the mother, the child does not develop the thinking process. And Bion says, when too much of this unprocessed stimuli are accumulating in the unconscious, they are thrown out, projected out, and then they come back as bizarre objects. So the bizarre feeling of the psychotic, the bizarre delusions of the psychotic are the evacuations of this bizarre material inside. The unprocessed material which is awaiting a thinker. And the child in childhood is incapable of being that thinker. He needs the mother to think it out for himself. This is what Bion says. Thoughts are awaiting a thinker. Unless a thinker comes and enables that manufacturing process of thought, a manufactured fully formed thought cannot occur. And that thinker is also a very good container. So his idea about the unconscious is this unique idea of fully formed thoughts and thoughts in progress occupying different spaces of the unconscious, which is something that we don't find in any other thing in psychoanalysis. So Bion's idea of the unconscious will have these two compartments. Jung's idea of the collective unconscious will be not there in unconscious of other psychoanalytic theories. And Lacan's idea of unconscious also is very different. He defines the psyche in terms of real, imaginary, and the symbolic. And in the unconscious, you will have real will be completely unconscious. Much of the imaginary will be unconscious, and part of the symbolic will be unconscious. I'll show the diagram in a moment, but just to introduce it. So his unconscious will be very different. So I'll go into what is the real, imaginary, and symbolic in a moment. But I'm just saying that these are very different from Freud ideas of the unconscious. So unconscious is not a settled question. It is still an ongoing debate. There is no question that it exists, but what is its shape and color? What are the compartments in it? How is it structurally organized? How is it functionally operational? Those are still open questions about the unconscious. It's not a settled question. Then another aspect comes out from parapsychology, which goes into phenomena like telepathy, precognition, retrocognition, and so on. And very few people know Freud, contrary to all popular belief, was deeply interested in telepathy. Because Freud gives this image that he is somebody who is completely into allopathy, into empirical thinking, into experimentation, who had this grand idea of the project to find the biological basis for entire psychoanalysis. The same Freud had a deep interest in telepathy. In fact, it was even more accentuated after Jung, because Jung was very much interested in this idea. And Freud had this very paradoxical approach to it. He writes to Jung, he says to Jung, don't go too far, don't go so far when you are so near. And that had two meanings. One, don't go so far from me, you are very near to me, emotionally speaking. Because he used to call Jung my crown prince. And he wanted Jung to take over the psychoanalytic movement as a leader after his death. And there were many reasons. Jung was brilliant. He was not a Jew, he was a Christian. And he came from very wealthy Swiss family. I mean, his wife was very wealthy. So he was now a very wealthy Swiss family, Christian, and he wanted psychoanalytic movement to be led by somebody like him so that the anti-Semitic feeling against psychoanalysis goes away. Because during his time, many bigoted minds used to call psychoanalysis the Jewish perversion. And he wanted to mainstream psychoanalysis. And Jung was a perfect candidate. But when Jung started going off in his own areas, completely alien to Freud and to the mainstream psychoanalytic movement, he wrote this, don't go so far when you are so near. And one of the meaning of that statement is, don't go into these esoteric areas of parapsychology, telepathy. Remain firmly grounded within the empirical framework of allopathy. But so this was one part of Freud asking Jung not to go too far and leave the areas of parapsychology. Paradoxically, Freud himself was deeply interested in telepathy. In fact, In collected works of Sigmund Freud, there is almost a near full paper on telepathy. We can still read that almost an article or a paper kind of thing on telepathy. And there was a meeting which happened of Freud and his associates where they convinced Freud not to go into this area. And Freud agreed that it was not in the interest of psychoanalysis at that moment because it was trying to gain respect as a scientific discipline. And anything of this sort will not go in the same line. So to keep psychoanalysis mainstreamed and acceptable to the modern science, particularly medicine, Freud dropped his interest in telepathy. And he says, if at some place he says, if I had to live my life all over again, one of the changes I would do is to spend more time in telepathy. And it is not difficult to understand why. Because if you look at the features of psychoanalysis in terms of transference, projective identification, the way things happen in the therapy room, all of these are mystical processes. And all of them are very near to telepathy or maybe involving telepathy. So it is not difficult to understand Freud's idea, but then this raises questions about the structure and functioning of the unconscious. Okay, how does telepathy happen? How does projective identification happen? How can somebody put feelings into you, ideas into you, without saying a word, without himself knowing about it? The patient is angry, you start feeling anger. He doesn't know that he is feeling angry. He has not said a word about it. But when you interpret and he looks inside, he actually realizes that yes, there is anger in him. So this mystical transmission may involve anything, including telepathy. Now, some more questions about the unconscious. Is the unconscious transgenerational? Jung was open to this idea that pathology may move from one generation to another, not only in behavioral terms, but also in genetic terms. But everyone got frightened about it because this easily can lead to racism, that some races are superior to others because of transmission through genes. And all those who are terrified of the idea of racism, they unfortunately go into this idea of the blank sheet of mind, which is not true. Experiments on rats have shown that even though you don't allow any contact between two generations, the traumatic things go at least till 3 to 4 generations. Which means there is a transgenerational transmission of trauma genetically, even if you don't have any behavioral contact. Second is those who believe in reincarnation, they talk about is the unconscious reincarnational. And those who believe in the idea, they say that the unconscious is not isolated from past lives. It is a continuity. Third important idea is the unconscious in communion with other animals or can it get in communion? Anybody who has pets will know that there is an unconscious transmission between the two. That probably even in animals, between animals and human beings, there is an unconscious transmission of ideas, feelings, and material. So that raises very different questions about how the unconscious is structured and functions. That the human unconscious may not be limited to human activity. It may be open probably to more mammalian activity. And the last question is the unconscious in communion with nature? Because we see the moment we are in nature, near an ocean, near a river, in the forest, with mountains, we feel a different kind of peace. We find a different kind of healing. So maybe the unconscious is in some strange way communion with nature. So these are some of the ideas which are still not settled, but I just wanted to put those ideas as food for thought when we think about the unconscious, that it's actually a completely open question. And from 100 different directions, 100 different ideas are coming, and they are still in the process of that Samudra Manthan when it comes to the idea of the unconscious. It is not only not a settled question, it is not even a mature question. It is still a nascent question. It is still in the childhood state and yet to become a mature question. So just to give different ways people look at the unconscious, I have put 4 models here. This is the classical Freudian model that we all know. This is the conscious, and part of the ego, complete part of it, and part of the superego is in the unconscious. There is a mistake here. Part of the ego is here, part of the superego is here. It's a mistaken thing, but I just took it from the net for our discussion. So this is one way to look at the unconscious, that it contains it contains part of the ego, it contains part of the superego. And it's much larger than the conscience. Now, this is Freud's way of looking at the unconscious. Now, look at the Jung's way. This is Jung's model of the mind. There is a self at the center, surrounded by collective unconscious, surrounded by personal unconscious, and then there is ego and the persona. Some people will put ego in the persona and divide it into 2, the persona part of the ego and the shadow part of the ego. So we will take that model of the mind when we do Carl Jung. We will use Anthony Stevens' model of the mind, where he puts ego in the persona. And as I said before, the line connecting ego to the self is called the ego-self axis. And the strength of this axis is very important for good psychological health. Which means the ego still is in connection with the personal unconscious, with the collective unconscious and the self. If the ego is too much under the influence of environment and very little in the influence of these things, then there is trouble, because this axis is weakened. So if you look at this, the unconscious here is in 2 parts, the collective unconscious and the personal unconscious. Both together constitute the unconscious. So it's a very different idea from Freud's unconscious, very different from Lacan, very different from Bion. The idea of the unconscious is very different. It is one, the unconscious here is not the deepest part of the mind. The deepest part of the mind is the self. Contrary to all other analysis. Yes, please.
Self has all 3, no? Conscious, unconscious, as well as preconscious.
In Jung's model of the mind, self is a distinct entity which regulates this whole. It is like the CPU, and all of these are operated by that CPU. So the self is the coordinator of the whole system. It is a center. And self is surrounded first by the collective unconscious, and then by personal unconscious, and then the persona. So if you talk of the unconscious in Jung, in one way, the personal unconscious, collective unconscious, and the self, all the three are unconscious. In fact, the self is the most unconscious of the all. But the self actually is the regulating entity, the coordinator, a much bigger coordinator than the ego. So you have two coordinators here, the self and the ego. It's almost like the ego is coordinating between the external reality and the personal unconscious, whereas the self is coordinating the collective unconscious, the personal unconscious, and the ego. So we see two coordinators almost here. So if you look strictly from definition, what is in awareness and what is not in awareness, then Jung's unconscious by that definition will be personal unconscious, collective unconscious, and self. All the three are unconscious by the simple definition. But if you look at it functionally, then functionally Jung will say that my unconscious is collective unconscious and personal unconscious, and self should be kept separate as a coordinator of this unconscious space. That there is a distinct coordinator in the unconscious, contrary to other thinkers who don't have this kind of a distinct coordinator. And this activates and deactivates archetypes based upon the age-appropriate function. So this is Jung's idea of the unconscious, which Jung usually will say it is combination of personal and collective unconscious. Now coming to Lacan's idea of the mind. This is Lacan's model of the mind. He divides mind into three: real, imaginary, and the symbol. And all the three are woven together like this disc that we used to play in childhood. That if one disc is removed, all of them come out. All the three are unwounded. He calls this the Borromean knot. That all the three rings are encircled into each other in a way that if one is undone, the other two will get undone. Lacan uses a famous phrase for it, for psychotic. He says, some people come undone. And it has two meanings. One is the sir, you are muted.
What does he mean by under?
Undone.
Undone.
So there are two meanings. Lacan loves to use this kind of statements which have multiple meanings. They are called gnomes, Gnomes, gnomes. Like they have multiple meanings. Like, let me give two examples. He says, and he likes to shock people. So he will say, the theory of Lacan does not exist. He is teaching the theory of Lacan, and he will say, theory of Lacan does not exist. Meaning, the theory is continuously evolving. It does not exist as a full-made theory. Second meaning is that Lacan considers himself to be a strict Freudian, and therefore his theory is actually a modified Freud's theory. So he will use the statement, theory of Lacan does not exist, to mean these two things. Then he will use the word statement, the woman does not exist. By that, what he means is that femininity is fluidity. And there is no constant pole which you can say is a stable pole in that feminine world. It is the paternal, even in the woman, which gives that solidity and stability. So it is the paternal in woman that is what exists as something stable. Everything else is fluid. and therefore the woman does not exist. Meaning the woman as something solid, stable does not exist. It is the paternal in her which gives that solidity. Similarly, he will say, desire is the desire of the other. So it has multiple meanings. One, that we desire what we don't have, the other. And therefore desire is the desire of the other. But the second meaning of that is, we have learned what to desire from society and parents. They have told us what to desire. And therefore our desire predominantly is their desire. And therefore desire is the desire of the other. It takes a long time before we are able to find out what is our real desire. Because most of the desires are handed down to us. We are taught how to desire. It takes a long time before we can be free from this and have really our own desire. So he says, desire is the desire of the other with multiple meanings. Similarly, he says, some people come undone. There are two meanings. Sexually, some people have premature ejaculation and they come out undone. They are not done with the sexual act, but the ejaculation happens. They still have a lot of things to do in their mind, but they can't do it because ejaculation has happened and now they are energyless. They can't carry on with the sexual act. So they have come undone. They did not come after they did everything they had to do. They came before it prematurely. So they come out undone. Sexual meaning of it. And the psychotic meaning in the psychotic area is, some people come undone, meaning these three rings come out undone. The three rings are undone. The meshing of the rings is undone, and that is what leads to psychosis. And some people have a constitutional predisposition to it, and they come from nature predisposed to being undone in terms of the rings getting undone and they developing psychosis. And they come predisposed for that. They come undone. That they never have the constitutional capacity or experiences that these three Borromean knots, that these three rings will come into a healthy Borromean knot, they come undone. So Lacan loves to do this. Now, what does he mean by this? Real is that part of the mind in which there is full-blooded experience without any symbolization or language. And part of it is pre-linguistic. It happened before we learnt language. And part of it is post it, but it is still reservoir of those things where things are visceral, real, without any language or symbolization. Because language and symbolization takes away the intensity of experience. The imaginary is full of fantasies. And the symbolic is where language and logic operates, symbolization operates. And he thinks of the human mind as a collection of these three coming together. That which is non-linguistic, that which is fantastical, and that which is suffused with logic and symbols and language. So his idea of the unconscious is very different. His idea of conscious also is very different. And his unconscious will be, entire real will be unconscious. Part of the imaginary, which is outside of the real, will also be unconscious. That part of symbolic, which is overlapping with the real, will be unconscious. Some part of the symbolic overlapping with the imaginary also will be unconscious. We don't have to go deeper into Lacanian model of the mind. We are not doing it because I am one of those who is very strongly opposed to Lacan in most ways. So I am one of those opposed to Lacan, but just to have a point of what he says. In fact, Lacan likes gnomes. So I have one lecture in my channel where I say that one of the gnomes is Lacan needs a tranquilizer. And it has multiple meanings. That the man is really overheated in his mind and needs to relax. And second is you have to calm him down so that he does not generate more nonsense.
Words, meanings slip on the words. Was that the word what he said?
Yes.
Yeah.
He loves to play with language.
Mm.
He loves to play with statements which are shocking and have multiple meanings. So in his idea, there are three ways pathology develops. One is repression. There are three, I forget the middle one always. There are three basic mechanisms of pathology. One is repression, perversion, and disavowal. So he will divide the entire DSM into three. All pathologies where repression is the core mechanism. Second category of sicknesses where perversion is the core mechanism. And third, where you have disavowal. Now, disavowal is something very interesting. It is refusal. It is the incapacity to accept castration. Like in repressive pathology, there is too much of castration. In perversion pathology, there is incapability to endure castration, even if you want it. So pervert, sorry, so in the pervert refuses castration.
Why should someone want castration or accept castration?
So one of the things that Lacan does is he generalizes and metaphorizes Freud.
Mm-hmm.
So Lacan's castration is whenever a limit is set to your desire by reality or morality, it's castration. So he has generalized Freud's idea of castration. It's no longer limited to Oedipus. So what he does is he generalizes and metaphorizes Freud. Like penis, he converts into a phallus, and phallus he converts into a discourse of power with the world.
Power with the
world. And where you are set a limit to, that is castration. That if I have to be sane, I have to accept the limits of my desire, which means I have to accept my castration. And I have to accept castration by reality and castration by morality in order to be sane. A pervert refuses this castration. He refuses the do's and don'ts of reality and morality. And a psychotic wants to be castrated but is incapable of castration. He is not refusing. He is incapable of castration. He is incapable of accepting the limits of reality and morality. He is not refusing by will. The refusal is by incapability. So Lacan will put all pathology into these three. Pathology because of a repressive process of desire frustration. Pathology because of perversion, where you refuse castration. And pathology because of psychosis, where you are incapable of castration. You don't refuse it, you want it, but you are incapable. You are incapable of accepting the do's and don'ts of reality. So his idea about pathology is very different in terms of causation. And his model of the mind is different. And therefore, his idea of the unconscious also is very different. So I'm just trying to open up the question of the unconscious, that there are so many ways to think about it. And it will take another 25 years before we are clear about the unconscious. Because the most complex gadget in this world is the human mind. And the most complex part of the human mind is the human unconscious. So we are dealing with the most complex area in this world. And it should not be a surprise that it's an open question and such a complex question. So we see Freud's idea of the unconscious, Jung's idea, Lacan's idea, how different they are. They almost look like completely different paradigms. These are not differences within one paradigm. These are different paradigms themselves. The difference of opinion is not of a shade. It's a paradigmatic difference of opinion. Like difference between Freud and Klein is still within the same paradigm. But if you look at Freud and Kohut, Freud and Lacan, Freud and Jung, these are different paradigms altogether within psychoanalysis. Now, I have put here Sri Aurobindo's model of the mind. It's very detailed. It will take a few sessions just to go into it. So I won't go into it, but what I will say is this, that his idea of the unconscious is very different in two ways. One, he uses three words: subliminal, subconscient, and inconscient. Now, from Freud's or normal psychoanalytic point of view, all the three will be unconscious. Now, how do you do a granular analysis of it? Part of the subliminal will be what Freud calls the preconscious. But the subconscient and the inconscient are very different in terms of their qualitative nature. Although both are out of our awareness, the inconscient is strictly rooted in the physical part of our biology, whereas the subconscient is rooted in something that is severely repressed. So according to him, what is severely repressed develops its roots in the very biology, very physical nature of our body. One. And two, the inconscient, the subconscient, and the subliminal, they are not only individual, but they are also in communion with nature. So there is an individual subconscient which is connected to the natural subconscient of the whole planetary system, or maybe the whole galaxy, whatever you call it. So there is it's like you take a glass of water from the ocean. You say, this is my glass of water. But you have taken it from the ocean, and imagine the glass of water is in contact with the ocean, with some holes where the exchange is taking place. That you have your glass of water, but there are some holes in the glass and there is an ocean. So originally the glass was empty. Through these holes, ocean water entered it, and now it becomes your water. But it is still in communion with the ocean water. There is an interplay, exchange. So the idea of unconscious here is very different. One, it is divided into the subconscient and the inconscient. Two, both of them are in communion with larger natural subconscient and the natural inconscient, which are like planetary or universal. So let us look at this in slightly details. this is how he puts the range of consciousness. So
Give me a moment. I'll call you after some time. So,
So Sri Aurobindo's model of the mind is, it's a very complicated model as we saw, but just to have the range of consciousness, he puts the range like this. From the bottom, it is inconscient, at the top is supermind, and normally we live at number 6, our mind proper. So the hierarchy of consciousness is inconscient, which is completely inconscient, subconscious, still can come in the dreams, physical mind, which operates the physical functions of the body, vital mind, which is dealing with the emotional part of our nature, mind, which is dealing with ordinary logic, and then higher mind, where higher creations of art and intellect happen, illumined mind, where there are flashes of intuition, which is where we say, okay, this is not an ordinary person, he is a gifted person. He has those flashes of intuition. They are not deductions from logical thinking. They are intuitions which are coming from somewhere else. And in the illumined mind, there are intuitions, the flashes of intuition. And in intuitive mind, these flashes become stable. You are able to be stably creative. Intuition after intuition after intuition. Some people who are extremely creative live most of the time here. You see the output flowing, one book after another, one song after another, one musical composition after another, one painting after another. So they are living by and large in intuitive mind. Some people touch the illumined mind once or twice and then never go back. And many artists are of this type. They make one or two good creations and then nowhere to be seen. So they went for some time into the illumined mind, got those flashes of intuition, but after that they could not go there. And Sri Aurobindo's yoga, the idea is that you keep rising from here to here to here, and then stabilize yourself, and then bring that thing in to be your state 24/7. So there are two movements, ascent and descent. You go up, understand these states, and then bring them down so that they become your states 24/7. So there is cyclical movement of ascent and descent of self-development. So if you look at his idea, then this is the mind where we ordinarily live. These are higher ranges of the mind, which he has classified, and lower than mind ranges, ending in the inconscient. So his idea of the unconscious will be the subconscious and the inconscient, as well as they link to universal subconscious and universal inconscient. So his unconscious is not strictly individual and very different from Freud and Jung's unconscious and Lacan's unconscious, and linked to universal forces. Like Jung was confused that while the endowment in the collective unconscious is intergenerational and evolutionary, is it linked to something which is called a universal unconscious? He was still not clear. So is the collective unconscious individual, or is it operationally linked to everything else? Is the million-year-old man in me transmitted only through genes, or is the million-year-old man in me linked to all other million-year-old men in everybody? So you see the different ways of how the unconscious is being looked at, very, very different. And as I said, we are dealing with the most complex area in the world, the human unconscious. And no wonder we have so many different ideas, and over a period of time, they will come together in some grand theory. Any questions on this? It's very, very new.
Aurobindo's Satchidananda and Supermind, are we referring to cosmic consciousness somewhere?
Yes, there are. Uh,
that we all are the part of Paramatma, and Jivatma is a morsel of that in each body, and it is caught in it.
correct.
And there is an
Yeah.
Abhanga by Jnaneshwar, Sant Jnaneshwar. कान्होबा तुझी घोंगडी चांगली आम्हाला का दिली वांगली. You have a better body than ours. Our body is, it falls prey to temptations, Shadvikar, and yours is super fine. It is beyond all that. Trigun. So,
So, samadhi is a state where one loses one's individual consciousness, but possibly, this is how I understand it. I'm not very sure, but this is how I understand it. That just below the state of samadhi, where there is oceanic oneness and losing of oneself, just below that is probably a state of supermind, from which all the creation starts. And his idea is that evolution is nothing but the mirror image of involution. That evolution is happening because involution first happened. That the supermind descended into the inconscient, and now from the inconscient slowly again they're traveling up to the supermind is starting, which is what we call evolution. So at the level of supermind there is a unity, although there is diversity, but there is unity. Like
yes.
in the supermind state, supramental state, you can have different individuals, but they know they are all connected. In the overmind state, you can temporarily think of the unity, but you will also see differences. The unity is not 24/7. So just below that state of samadhi, probably there is a state of supermind where the creation happens. And you are not out of the creation, but you see unity. And this is the whole idea of Sri Aurobindo's developmental process, what he calls integral yoga. The details are here. You can see the ranges of the mind, one by one by one, going up to this. And then you have the state of samadhi, the Sachidananda. And below, you can see the states of mind going below. And on either sides, you have connection with universal nature. So you have the 5 bodies of Tantra, the Annamay Kosh, the Vijnanmay, the Annamay Kosh, the Pranamay Kosh, the Bhavanatmak Kosh, the Manomay Kosh, the Vijnanmay Kosh, and the Bliss, Anandmay Kosh. So you have 5 bodies like this, and the five bodies coordinated by 7 chakras, and then those states of mind, above and below. And all of this in connection with universal nature. That is how his model of the mind is. So actually, it's not a model of the mind. You should say it's a model of reality in a seen from the vantage point of an individual. Okay. So this was the unconscious, and now we come to today's discussion. Last paper of Freud, meta-psychological paper, the ego and the id. This is the chapter where the structural model of the mind evolved. In this chapter, first time, he comes into the structural model of the mind and id, ego, and superego. And how does he come to it? He says that originally there is only id. Slowly, the mind recognizes that for survival, it is necessary to modulate and coordinate between the id inside and the environment outside. And therefore, sheer out of survival necessity, one part of the id converts into ego, which then coordinates between the id and the environment outside. And the coordinator has autonomy. It can say no to the id. it can attenuate the id. It can say no to the environment. It can attenuate the environment. And somehow it develops a compromise between id inside and the environment or reality outside. So he is the adapter of the inside to the outside. So one part of the id becomes the ego. And then something happens. The ego, a part of the ego realizes that certain decisions of it, certain actions of it are admired more than the others. So he learns, the ego learns, the id also learns that certain things are admired more than the others. And the ego and the id both want that admiration. So in order to do it again and again, they learn that the environment is saying on certain things, thou shalt do it. It is good to do it. And if you do, you get admiration, you get acceptance, you get rewards. And therefore, what happens is a part of the ego changes itself to become reservoir of those things which bring acceptance and admiration from environment. And this part Freud calls the ego ideal. The ego ideal originally is not actually a part of superego. It's one part of the ego modifies itself. The superego is still not formed, according to Freud. So Freud's idea is originally there was only id. One part of the id, out of sheer necessity of survival, becomes the ego. So the ego emerges out of the id. And one part of the ego, in order to have rewards, appreciation, love, becomes a reservoir of those things which are admired. And that becomes ego ideal. That part of the ego in which what the environment talks to be ideal is stored. So that is the storage space and the operating space for that which is rewarded, idealized by the environment. So a part of the ego becomes ego ideal. And at the end of the Oedipus complex, to this thou shall is added thou shall not. So one part of the ego then becomes conscience, thou shall not. Freud uses the word conscience, meaning the punitive part, thou shall not. So now in the ego you have the ego ideal and the conscience, and the two separate to become superego. And the superego has two parts. The positive part of the superego, thou shall, and the punitive part of the superego, thou shall not. And slowly the three-agent, three-player model crystallizes of the id, ego, and superego, where the id is completely unconscious, superego and ego partly are unconscious, partly are conscious. And this is how the structural model is coming out. The positive part of the superego is pre-Oedipal, whereas the punitive part of the superego, thou shall not, it is at the end of the Oedipus complex. That in order to resolve the Oedipus complex, there is no way out but to accept a permanent thou shall not. And therefore a separate agency is created inside the mind, which will always tell you thou shall not. And that combines then with thou shall and forms the superego. And it has two parts, thou shall not. And you have the ego, which is coordinating between id and the external reality. Now the ego gets another function. Because just as The id is demanding its own satisfaction, which may very well be perverted satisfaction. The superego is demanding its own satisfaction, which is highly idealistic, which also is not practical. So now the ego has to not only temper down the id, it also has to temper down the superego. It not only has to play adaptive function between the id and the environment, it now has to play an adaptive function between the superego and the environment, as well as superego and the id. So in the adult, once the crystallization happens, then the ego is a coordinator between id and the environment, superego and the environment, id and the superego, as well as id, superego and the environment. It becomes like a traffic police coordinating this whole thing at the service of survival and pleasure. So it becomes like a super coordinator between all the three entities, the superego, the id, and the environment. It may have to optimize any of the flows. Flow between superego to the environment, flow from id to the environment, flow between superego and id, flow between id and superego together and the environment. Any kind of flow, it has to optimize at the service of evolution and pleasure. So this is how Freud comes to it. And these are some details of it. Should we break for a cup of tea and then do the details? Any questions?
I remember egotization of psychoanalysis, with which Kohut and I don't remember the other name. They were affiliated with that.
It's a very good point you have brought out, because once you say these are the three structural components of the psyche, then a natural logical question is, can each of them be used to heal pathology? And therefore, in generation and healing of pathology, there will be three different ways of looking at it. Id focused, ego focused, and superego focused. The Freudian way is id focused. Anna Freud and Hartmann developed this complete area of psychoanalysis called ego psychology.
It's Lewis and Hart.
Yeah. Hartmann and Anna Freud started it, and then others joined in. So they created what you said, the egoization of psychoanalysis. And some people outside of psychoanalysis created something called logotherapy or existential therapy, some parts of existential therapy, where the whole focus is on purpose and meaning in life, which are largely concerns of the superego. So when you give yourself a larger than life purpose, idealistic purpose, you marshal the superego strength. So we'll discuss this in the second part of our discussion, that once we say the three constitute the mind, then obviously generation and healing of pathology also will have three different roots. The id root of Freud, the ego root of Hartmann and Anna Freud, and the superego root of logotherapy. So let's break for a cup of tea and then carry this discussion forward.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
So now we come to the practical application of Freud's paper, the ego and the id. Once you say there are three components of the psyche, then obviously the question is, which of them is responsible for generation of pathology, and which of them can be used to heal the pathology. From this standpoint, you can divide the entire DSM into 3 chapters: pathologies of id, pathologies of ego, and pathologies of superego. That's one simplistic way of looking at it. Now let us look at how you look at it differently. Freud put a lot of emphasis on id-driven pathology. His basic idea was what is called the drive school. The basic idea of any drive school is there is a very strong desire frustrated by reality or morality, therefore the trauma. The second way of looking at it is, so one is the sheer power of desire and the dissatisfaction because of reality or morality. That is the cause of trauma, one way of looking at it. So basically, it is nothing but unsatisfied desire in different ways. Second way of looking at it is that it is not the dissatisfaction of desire, but how you manage that dissatisfaction. That is where the ego defenses come in. And therefore, the focus shifts from managing id to managing the ego. And there, those who are into ego psychology, they say that the whole goal of therapy is to move from weak defenses to strong defenses, immature defenses to mature defenses, psychotic defenses to neurotic defenses. So this whole movement from immature to mature defenses, unhealthy to healthy defenses, this is the work of ego, and therefore the whole focus there is on defense work. They are not trying to explore so much the desire in the unconscious, the satisfaction or addiction of it, or the dissatisfaction of it. Rather, whatever happens, satisfaction, dissatisfaction, how does the ego regulate the outcomes of that? So their focus is completely on the defense work. And for them, the very important parameter is ego strength. In fact, a good word for that would be ego efficiency. Because two things are involved: application of the right defense and application of the right defense with right strength. So there is a selection part of it, and there is a power part of it. That of all the basket of defenses available, you pick a particular defense for a particular application. And that selection may be mature or immature, psychotic or neurotic, healthy or unhealthy. So the first component that ego has to do, first function, is select the right defense. And second is have the power to apply it with adequate strength. So we use the word ego strength roughly speaking, but personally I feel ego efficiency or ego effectiveness is a much better one, because it has two components: the selection of defense and the power or the strength of the defense. So those who are focusing on this, they primarily do defense work for healing. Now the third part of it. Yeah, but one more part of it. The ego strength, so to say, there are three parts of it. In a way, Freud agreed, not in the primacy of defenses over the situation in the ego, but in the primacy of ego over the id. So Freud's famous statement is, where id is, there ego shall be. This was his statement of healing, that where the excess of id is, there ego shall be. In simple words, where desire is, there reality acceptance shall be. So today, an area of the mind completely captured by desire, we want that to be under the control of reality acceptance. But Kohut said something very interesting. He said that there is something called the self, and it is the healthiness of the self which in turn leads to the ego strength. And his idea was very interesting. He said कि the split being open, the Oedipus being unresolved, some problem in some psychosexual stage is very, very common. But these problems don't necessarily translate always into a pathology for which somebody will come for healing. He says that all these problems, even if they exist, they can be managed or repressed successfully by the ego or the self if the self is healthy. Meaning, imagine two situations. Situation one, you are a traffic police standing on a road and there are only two roads to manage. So traffic is coming only from two sides and you are, as a policeman, traffic policeman, you have to manage traffic only on two sides. And the traffic also is mild to moderate. Now imagine a situation, you are in the center of 5 roads and traffic is coming from 5 directions and the volume is heavy. He says, if the self is strong enough, then you can manage the complex traffic. If the self is strong enough, you can manage the complex traffic. And even if the traffic is there, will not lead to pathology. Meaning, even if there is a problem in some developmental stage, it will not necessarily translate into adult pathology if the self is strong, because if the self is strong, the ego strength will be high. So now what you have is, you are still looking at ego to prevent pathology, but the ego itself is deriving its strength from self. So you have the healthy self leading to a strong ego, leading to a strong coordination and control. So you don't go into solving the basic split or the Oedipus. You just put a good coordinator who puts a good lead over them and regulates them very well. And maybe perhaps heals them in some way, in a small way. So that idea of healing is a very different idea. Let me give a practical example. Say there is a businessman and this businessman is very respected in the city and in his family, and he is a very good mentor. He has mentored many people from scratch to become small businessmen or medium level businessmen. Over time, what happens is, those who he mentored, they go on to become big businessmen, and now nobody talks to him, nobody listens to him, nobody respects him anymore the way they used to. And this person suddenly develops paranoia and hypochondriasis. He is afraid to go out. He is now afraid to go in a lift. He is afraid to go into an aircraft. He is afraid to be alone. He is afraid some disease will happen to him. So whatever thought he has, he goes to a doctor to get a test done. So he once went to a doctor, and when nothing came out, the doctor said, just for the sake of it, complete the MRI. He went into the MRI machine, felt claustrophobic and came out. Now, how do you deal with this kind of pathology? There are two ways. One way is within psychoanalysis. Of course, CBT will deal with it very differently. They will go into gradual desensitization, cost-benefit analysis, and self-work and exposure and all of that. But within psychoanalysis, one way to look at it is that the self is depleted. And because the self is depleted, it is no longer getting the food, the fuel to keep it going, the fuel of admiration, the fuel of respect. So it's a social situation that you are no longer getting the social respect which was fueling your self-esteem. And that drop in the self-esteem has disintegrated the self, and therefore problems which were controlled before are now on the surface. So the two ways of healing are: you re-establish the older control situation, option one, and option two, you heal those problems at their roots. Now the difference is, in option one, if you re-establish the older equilibrium, which was good enough for him to live a healthy, happy life, because the ego was good enough to successfully repress and manage the problems, and he had no repercussions in personal or professional life. So one option is you re-establish the earlier equilibrium without solving the elemental problems, which is a question of months, or you go into solving those elemental problems, which is a problem of years. So it's much easier to put a traffic man to regulate the traffic, which is haywire, than to set the traffic right. Fundamental healing is far more difficult than managing a pathological situation. So there, what we do is, we are looking at the strong self leading to a strong superego strength, leading to a strong control without elemental healing. You are just re-establishing an older equilibrium which was good enough for the person. So this is how Kohut comes in, and this is how many times we do. We try to re-establish the older equilibrium which was good enough, rather than to go into elemental healing. One more point. So this is related to the ego part of it. Now the superego part of it. Sorry, just let me finish the id. In id part, one of the two good techniques are there. One is Lacanian, second is Tantric. Okay, of course, Freud had his own technique, but what you can add to Freud's technique? Technique is very important. It's called articulation of desire. And I often spend many times some sessions on this. Just tell me what your desires are. Just keep telling me your desires. Later we will classify them into those which are satisfied, those which can be satisfied, and those which can never be satisfied. And then we go into mourning of those which can never be satisfied. But first, let us classify the desires. And for classifying, let us know the desires. So one of the very important techniques of Lacan is articulation of desire. The techniques is exhaust the desire by articulation. Articulate so much that it's exhausted. And this has 2 or 3 phases. One phase is, initially when you start with normal social desires that everyone has. I want money, I want a beautiful woman, I want house in a good area, a fancy car, foreign vacation. My children should study in an IB school and sort of that sort of. Then slowly, more and more repressed desires come. And the patient says, I never knew I had this desire. And he says, what kind of strange desire is this? At times he will say, I feel ashamed. This is a desire. Second stage. Third stage, psychotic desires come out. Some of them may be extremely psychotic in nature. Somebody will say, I want to eat this table. He said, no, no, I really want to eat it. I wish I could. I can't chew it and I can't digest it. Otherwise, I wish I could. If I could, I would have eaten this table. It's psychotic desire. You allow those desires also to come out. That is how the self is emptied out of unspoken desires. Speaking the desire itself gives relief. That you speak feeling safe and uninhibited, and in an amoral way you are accepted. So that is a very important tool in dealing with the id, the articulation of desire, exhaustion of desire by articulation. Understand the desire so deeply that it does not trouble you.
Can I share something?
Please.
It may be a distraction or something. I am seeing currently a girl is referred to us who was sexually abused in an incestuous fashion uh, for for a long duration, and she's referred to us. And she's referred after 4 months of living in a rescue home. So on the way to the clinic, she expressed reluctance and fear with the attendant sister from the institution that, oh, will I have to narrate everything again now? So that sister told us that she was saying this. So we decided on the spur of the moment that we will not ask her anything and carry on. And we began, and she was also in a normal mood. She had overcome already, it seemed. And at times she would avoid gaze, look here, there, and act like a child, but she was very attentive. And then I asked her our three wishes test because she was 14 years old. I said, give me three wishes. And she said, my grandparents should be safe. Everything good should happen to them, and I should be capable of meeting their desires. And now I asked her an adolescent kind of a question, I mean, not like a child. I asked her, okay, now tell me what could be the doctor's three desires. So role reversal I did, and I gave her the batting, and she started batting. She smiled, and she said, the doctor will feel, I believe, that patient should understand whatever I'm speaking. So I realized that she finds some of my talk rather gibberish, maybe. Second, she said that all patients should get well. And then there was a pause, and prompted her, and there was a lady counselor sitting with me, student intern, and she said, doctor should be, after we prompted her, he say, come out, give the third wish. She said the doctor should get good payment. We took it jovially, in a hearty fashion, and told her that we are not looking forward to getting any money. This is because the CWC chief, who happened to be my student in the past, has referred you. So you are here, and we don't want any fees. But you just speak freely, and that will perhaps lead to something helpful. And then it continued. But this was the way she dealt with. articulation of desires. When I started imagining myself in those shoes now, when you asked me, it was very funny. Like, apart from being a Darwinian man who wants to live the longest and procreate to the maximal extent, it will be funny really to free associate about what would be the strange desires. That was, so it will be very nice. And there was something else about the desires, articulation of desires, that or the ego and the id. Yeah, the general comment about what you have been teaching us, well, during the first part and now, was that the id also has a storehouse of creativity and all the energy. Ego also may have inhibiting and binding this thing. Uh, and superego can be, apart from being negative, can be positive also, and can hold you from making any mistakes or pap, prevent you from doing any pap.
Right.
So these were the free associations that came to my mind. I felt like voicing them. Thank you.
Very
Please
good.
go ahead, sir.
Yeah, all of them are to the point. And for this girl, safety is paramount.
Yes, sir.
Any patient of trauma or abuse, the safety is paramount. And people unnecessarily make haste into interpretations. The best is to allow a few sessions to go just to feel safe.
Absolutely. Whatever her need is should come up rather than.
And what happens is that in this kind of patient, in this group of patients, the patient actually adopts, more often than not, guilt and shame of the aggressor. Okay, the aggressor should be feeling guilt and shame. However, the patient feels it for him. And the patient finds it very shameful or guiltful to narrate the abuse, because one of the secret voices in that patient is that in a secret way you collaborated, you called for it. It happened to you and nobody else, not because of nothing. You called for it. And that is a defense against anger. That if this self-blaming is not done, then the aggression towards the aggressor comes up, and that is so horrifying that the person doesn't want to deal with it and actually is terrified of that anger taking him over. And often it is entangled with loss. That one part of the mind does not want to lose that person, because whatever aggressive acts he may have done, abusive acts, he is still loved by one part of the mind, especially with respect to parents or relatives. So one part of the mind does not want to lose that person. Second part of the mind is terrified of the intensity of brutality and anger. And therefore the way out is to cover that up by adopting guilt and shame of the other. And therefore, when we ask them to feel the anger towards the aggressor, instead of anger, huge amount of anxiety comes. It is the anxiety which has three components: anxiety of one's own anger, anxiety of loss, and anxiety of further attack and abuse. Because in this kind of situations, when this happens, the person, because of social shame, more often than not feels helpless. And therefore, the omnipotence gets projected onto the other. So he is not the good omnipotent, he is the bad omnipotent. And that comes up even in therapy, that they find it terrifying to feel anger against somebody who is seen as omnipotent and evil. So these things naturally come up in the therapy of patients who are into uh, trauma or sexual abuse. It takes a long time before safety is established and they are able to accept their anger towards the aggressor.
Absolutely. Forgive me, but uh, we formed a rapport rather quickly, like a borderline person. And then she's wanted to come every day to the clinic, which is not possible because the institute is governed by rules and laws, and they are sending once a week is too much for them. And that was one. And second was, I could see the traces of victim becoming abuser. So protect me from that kind of an interpretation if it is not correct. I could see that a couple of interns were outside. She chose one and asked them, why do you work? Hey, just go to sleep. Zopa kadacha. So she is already against the system and she is owning that up. She's looking forward to ways of dominating others. That was the report from the rescue home. And so she's becoming already identifying after the abuser and aggressor.
Correct.
That was the,
So repeating the traumatic event or becoming like the aggressor are very common.
yeah. And we should be able to prevent that ideally. So I thought that I should not make an unwarranted negative interpretation.
No, no, no. It will actually come up between you
Yeah.
that either you will feel like abusing her,
Mm,
you will have that thought,
mm,
or you will feel dominated.
mm.
So what will happen is this will be the projective identification from her to you. And this will have two aspects to it. One aspect will be the sheer, what Freud says, return of the repressed. That the repressed is alive, it is not dead. And its characteristic is it repeats whenever it finds an opportunity. And one of the ideas of therapy is that whatever is problematic in real life will play out in therapy in some way. And that is how it gets healed. When it plays out, we catch it and we work on it. Otherwise, people say that so many different things of such different color and flavor, how can they be healed in this simple format of therapy? It is because everything gets replayed here. So, your identification with the aggressor will happen at some time. At that time, there will be a return of the repressed from her, and there will be a fear desire combined in her. What if he abuses me? And at that point, you might get that idea of abusing her. That's a projective identification. Now, obviously, you are not going to act upon it, but you note it. Okay, it is happening in me. That the return of the repressed is happening at the unconscious level. Most people will not do it consciously. Some will. Some
Kind
will.
of, sorry, sorry.
Please go ahead.
Kind of being masochistic and bullied, victim of being bullying all my life. I'm more likely to get the other kind of experience where the patient tries to dominate the scene, and because our receptionist is extra kind, she also will allow, and then there will be some issue with the system, and she should not blame because of you. I did not get well. Because of you, I missed the exam. Because of you, I did not improve in time. And things like that are likely to happen. But with experience, I hope that I will be able to weather this well,
Maybe
no?
your experience and age definitely will help because what we solicit, there is a two-way traffic in transference and projective identification. They are not neutral objective facts.
Yes.
Some of them are, but most of them are not.
Yes.
So it is also depends upon what we as a person solicit.
Yeah. And this in itself is protective that head of the child welfare committee feels it safe to send her to Dr. Pradikar. So
Correct.
that protects me from having untoward counter transference.
Correct. So what happens here is ki, this counter transference can be either you might feel dominating or you might feel submissive, right? But projective identification will be straight away you feel a desire to abuse, or straight away you feel the aggression that she is feeling towards you as an authority figure. The transference, what will happen is aggression from the abuser will be transferred to you wide projective identification. And you start feeling angry. So when you start feeling angry in the session, it is a welcome sign. Because it means at an unconscious level, she is feeling safe enough to mobilize the aggression towards the aggressor and communicate it to him, at least unconsciously. Similarly, in many cases of deep psychosis, the patient tells the therapist that you are crazy. And that is a welcome sign, because he feels safe enough to project his craziness into somebody and see it. That often is the turning point of healing. That the patient feels the therapist is crazy. Only place to be aware about in this kind of cases is if there is a psychotic element to it. Because if there is, then the fantasies of abuse can easily be thrown at the therapist or psychiatrist and says, he is trying to abuse me. That is a difficulty. In fact, in my city, it happened that a girl was schizophrenic, taken by the parents to a psychiatrist, and she started having these fantasies of abuse of the psychiatrist. So she called up the women's helpline. And the psychiatrist had to go to the police station and the parents had to come to save the psychiatrist. So that if the impulse control is low or psychosis is in force, then it's a tricky situation.
So it is best to have a chaperone all the time and not to interview alone.
Better.
Yes, sir.
Especially after the draconian laws that we have. Because the recent rape and sexual harassment laws are so draconian. It is no longer pro-women, it's actually anti-men. And with this kind of draconian laws, it's always better to play safe.
Yes, sir.
So, with superego, okay, so we have talked about the id and the ego. Now coming to superego. With superego, usually people talk of superego pathology, which is guilt-led pathology, shame-led pathology. I am not good enough feeling in social situations, social anxiety. Self-harm because of excessive superego. Self-destruction, self-sabotage because of excessive guilt. And dependent personalities have to be specially worried about. Dependent personalities and OCPD personalities. Because both of them are very extremely strong superego, very harsh. And they feel very guilty even at smallest of things. So they have to actually round off the harshness of the superego and save themselves from superego pathology. So what is superego pathology? There are two types. Too weak a superego that leads to impulse problems, perversion, sociopathy, antisocial, sociopathy, psychopathy. Too weak, a superego. There is absence of morality. That leads to one set of problems. And very harsh superego, another set of problems. So dependent and OCPD personalities have to worry about too harsh a superego. And histrionics have to worry about too weak a superego. And both are superego pathologies. If the superego is very weak, one set of pathology, very harsh, second set of pathology. So like everything else, it has to be optimized. One thing that we don't talk about is we talk about superego pathology. We don't talk about superego strength and superego happiness. That is also equally true. Superego provides a lot of strength. For example, when you are doing something idealistic, you may face the mightiest of people because of the inner superego strength. And superego happiness also comes from it, that when you do something ideal, a different kind of happiness comes in. Like you have 10 rupees and you give 5 rupees to a beggar. Actually, it's a pleasure reducing activity, strictly from an id point of view. But the superego point of view, actually you feel more happy. What we can also call enlightened masochism. That you deny yourself pleasure for a purpose. It may just be preparing for the examination and not going to a movie. That is one enlightened masochism. Or sacrificing for your children. Second enlightened masochism. At the same time, it's also it gives you superego happiness. That the money you could have spent and got pleasure out of, you keep it for your children. So the id happiness is sacrificed for superego happiness. And that is generally far more long-term and sustainable. From a long-term perspective, much better than the id happiness. So that also has to be mobilized, and logotherapy mobilizes this. It says, find a meaning in your life, and automatically you will find stronger. Because then you are looking at superego strength. Now what happens? The superego happiness you can see on the faces of saints or social workers who feel they have found their purpose in life. So the happiness on the face of somebody who is doing something idealistic or who has found a purpose in life, it's very different. It is not id-driven happiness. It is not ego-driven happiness. It is, the id-driven happiness is very sensual, very much power related. Ego-driven is very social, very power related. But the superego happiness is very idealistic. So that also is one source of happiness we can tap. Does not have to be always ego or id. We can also tap superego happiness. What happens in case of superego pathology? If the parents are very harsh, superego can be very harsh. Or superego may be very harsh just because of constitution. But usually, parents have been internalized. And the internalized parents are very harsh. Now, in reality, the parents may be idealistic or non-idealistic, but they are very harsh. And the harshness is inside. So wherever the person is, he feels somebody is observing and he will attack if he does A or B. So the parental imagos, and they are enriched with fantasy and omnipotence projection and idealization. Those extremely punitive, idealized, omnipotent figures are inside, and they have to be dealt with in superego pathology. And that is what will stop self-destruction and self-harm in 100 different ways. And the superego will do two primary things. It will go for primary repression in the unconscious, and it will result in aggression turned inwards. And the way out is guilt and shame, which are two no's of the superego. They have to be felt fully in the body and you let it go. And ISTDP is good in that. Many other techniques can also be used. But the whole idea is both guilt and shame have this nature. If you accept it, feel it fully and let it go, you get free from it. If you avoid this, then they live inside of you and do self-sabotage and punishment. So this is where the superego part of pathology comes in. So with this, we finish the meta-psychological things. I think we have one or two Freudian papers left, and then we can move on to either Jung or Klein. See you there.
Yes, sir.